All right, everybody, as you gather and enter, good morning and welcome to the 2020 Pop Conference Forever Young. Popular music and youth throughout the ages is our theme. My name is Jason King. I'm going to be your moderator for this session, and I am really happy, overjoyed to introduce this particular panel, which I felt I just had to moderate as an Edmontonian, as an Albertan. This is the Dream Team, the Canadian Dream Team. The title of this roundtable is I'm an Adult Now, Growing Up with CanCon in Canada, a focused roundtable. And I'm happy to introduce our roundtablists, panelists for today, Erin MacLeod, Cowie, Steacy Easton, Carl Wilson, Emily Gale, and Andrea Warner. Let's kick it off with Steacy Easton.
Rough Trade was two people, Kevin Shields and Carol Pope. Pope was a lesbian, Shields was queer. They had a hit in 1981 with a video on the nascent Much Music called High School Confidential, named after the Pulp text. It's a song mostly about queer women on women crushes through the lens of pop culture of the nostalgic kind, but kind of sleazy references. Quote, she's a combination Anita Ekberg, Mamie Van Doren, Dagmar, end quote. It also contains my favorite line about sex in a Canadian pop song, Maybe Ever. Quote, what's her perfume? Tigress by Fabergé. It makes me cream my jeans when she comes my way, end quote. That's my favorite for a lot of reasons, including Tigress is a fantastically over-the-top camp word. Impossible to use in daily vocabulary, although I try. Watching the video, hearing the track, I have all of these thoughts that come simultaneously. Carol Pope is hipper than me. Carol Pope is more fashionable than me. She's more explicit about her desires. She's queerer than most. Who else could get such a wet-ass pussy line onto CanCon airwaves circa 1980? She's better at a snarl, and she's smarter than me. But then I kept thinking, is this another kind of form of the late 70s nostalgia of the mid-1950s? Rough Trade's High School Confidential was 1981, give or take. Grease was 1978, the movie. American Graffiti was 1973. Forgetting Happy Days, I could spend a life on Happy Days. 1950s nostalgia has been here for longer than 1950s itself. Is High School Confidential the second wave post-Grease? Does the irony of performative nostalgia mar or reify its sincerity? Toronto is a secret excellent place to test this hypothesis, especially in the 1970s, because there was never really anything to be nostalgic about in Toronto. It was a cold, tied-off, formal. Its irony, it was a brittle one, and its queerness, one quite hidden. The decadence of Toronto was a decadence lost under a kind of high Presbyterian propriety. It was called Toronto the Good as a joke against the rep that Montreal had as a den of sin. Money was made in Toronto and spent elsewhere. It was also cold, physically cold. Icy winds off Lake Ontario in the middle of winter. The poet Lynn Reed, in her book of poems on Dusty Springfield, called the CN Tower, quote, a hypodermic needle jutting off into the sky, end quote, the nodding off being part of the suggestion of boredom. I quote Dusty Springfield because she was in Toronto for a winter with Carol Pope in a room in Cabbagetown, a fact confirmed in Pope's autobiography, Anti-Diva. Toronto can also be generic if you don't live there, if you don't get into those rooms. I could make an argument about the film industry here, but that was, I think, after 1981. Toronto has this pendulum swing. We have our own culture, but we borrow from America, and the anxiety about commercial borrowing or singular identity was fraught for decades after 1967, the centennial. We also kind of love America. In the 1970s, we were breaking away from Mother England, trying to find a way to be vulgar or at least sincerely love vulgarity. You know, in Cronenberg movies, where the idea of getting off and actually getting off and hating the body that allowed you to get off, and the kind of scientific precision that could measure those three competing forces, that is a very Toronto energy. American graffiti is vulgar and sincere and absurd and deeply committed to a kind of sexless body. Grease is much sexier than you think it is. It also features a line about creaming in jeans, and is not particularly good about women, but also deeply sincere about how and why to fuck. Kill Pope is deeply sexy and written by women for women and sincere, but she also has some of the coldness that can happen with Cronenberg. But she's also kind of in on the joke. Look at the women that Kill Pope is enamored with. Mamie Van Doren, the least famous, most cult, most outlandishly high femme of the 50s divas, even more self-aware of her own ridiculousness than Marilyn or Mansfield. Anita Ekberg, cold and European, in the middle of Fellini's biggest farces, but also strange, almost exploitation movies with titles like How I Learned to Love Women, or Women Times 7, or Fangs of the Living Dead. Dagmar wasn't even in the movies, a mid-1950s television star with a stilted delivery and a ballistic chest. She was even beneath the art of Ekberg and the mirth of Van Doren. I never know if Pope is making fun of these figures, but I think she is doing something very Canadian. Canadians are neither fish nor fowl, neither English, they're part of the Commonwealth, nor French, they're part of the Francophonie, and definitely not American, although influenced by its sheer mass. Canada makes do through a kind of ironic looking, a voyeuristic winking at desire, sort of like being a teenager and not belonging to any of the big houses yet, maybe even a perpetual adolescent. When Cole Pope sings about having a teenager crush, making her clean her jeans, she's being very sincere about the whole enterprise, but comparing her to Ekberg or Dagmar or Mamie and saying that she has more power than a teenage Brando is both allowing for the physical response, acknowledging its feelings, making fun of the feeling, casting power that her own skills as a tigress is better than any American self, and also perhaps that she can only look at it. She can only absorb the power of the presentation through a wry absorption of other people, a kind of weaponized scopophilic gaze, sort of like looking around that, let me try this one more time. Sort of like looking across that lake in the middle of winter and wondering what exactly would make them warm in the middle of all of this.
Thank you, Steacy. And next up is Erin MacLeod.
Okay, I'm going to start this with a video, and this will be a bilingual presentation, but for those of you who don't speak French, I have subtitles. So I'm just going to share my screen here.
Tequila, Heineken, pas le temps de niaiser.
Qu'est-ce que tu penses de...
Pas de niaiser.
Qu'est-ce que tu penses de notre événement, Candy?
L'événement est incroyable.
En 2012, la vidéo virale qui se nomme Tequila, Heineken, pas le temps de niaiser est rapidement devenue la plus populaire de l'année à Montréal et au Québec en général. Elle présente un jeune homme interviewé dans un club qui répond aux questions en utilisant, entre autres, certains mots d'argot haïtien. Celui-ci mentionne par exemple des grouillades, du mot créole gouillade, qui désigne une danse lascive sur la piste de danse. En plus de créole, le jeune homme utilise plusieurs termes de français proprement québécois, comme le verbe niaiser, qui signifie perdre du temps, combiné au juron tabarnak, inspiré de tabernacle. Dans l'entrevue de 45 secondes, il y a aussi une référence au dancehall jamaïcain et à l'artiste Vybz Kartel, en plus de termes en anglais qui se mélangent à tout ça. La vidéo initiale a été visionnée plus de 3 millions de fois. Un énorme marché par la vente de t-shirts et de produits dérivés reprenant ce slogan a aussi été développé. Dans la foulée, plusieurs remixes ont été lancés, alors que nombreuses analyses du phénomène ont été publiées. La grande popularité de cette vidéo comique dans la culture montréalaise est ainsi révélatrice. Ce court clip YouTube a captivé l'imagination de toute la province et est devenu une blague courante encore parfois entendue aujourd'hui. The love for this video in Montreal was extreme. As Montreal producer Poirier suggests, it, quote, speaks volumes about the culture and the people that live there, or here for me, and specifically youth culture and music. The video became something iconic on a wide scale, but at the same time, it represents the particularities and specificities of a space. The popularity of Tequila, Heineken, Pas le temps de niaiser also reflects the reality of Montreal. Layers of language connect with layers of culture. But what this video also represents is one young person's challenge to the doctrine of interculturalism, as presented by the Quebec government as a province-specific approach to the integration of immigrants to Canada. The rest of Canada has established multicultural policies that promote the idea of a coexistence of multiple cultures, and these policies have been subject to significant critique. But the 1978 Cultural Development Policy of Quebec, which followed up on the 1976 Law 101 that declared French the sole official language of Quebec, proposed another path, that of, quote, exchanges within a Quebec culture. The mosaic of multiculturalism is contrasted with the centrality of Francophone culture. It places French as first and foremost, rather than recognizing all cultures engaged in negotiation of Quebecois identity. The Tequila Heineken video challenges this concept of interculturalism. It denies the centrality of one culture and presents a mélange of languages and references, a single person getting his point across that requires an intimate engagement and negotiation between a range of cultures. Quebec's model does not acknowledge this individual, personal, daily layering of cultures that does not necessarily make use of some normative version of Quebecois culture as a trunk or center. This is a personal process of negotiation in the space of the nightclub, Montreal, or Quebec as a whole. Further youth-driven challenges to interculturalism are many. Musicians such as the hip-hop collective À la Claire Ensemble and the MC Small Talk have produced videos that represent Montreal as the same layered space, referencing multiple languages, religions, ethnicities, and cultures, from Spanish to Muslim to Haitian to Jewish to Joual. These artists recognize a different version of what interculturalism might even mean. And I'm just going to show you a couple clips. The first is from Small Talk, and the second is from À la Claire Ensemble.
Told a little and stolen Bixie. Top it up, buckle with me. Why I wait on my tail to fit me. One time I made that DJ hit me. Poppin' tag to the Super C. Undercover of fromage ici. Undercover of accuracy. Undercover's with Virginie.
Celine Dion. Money. Ain't Elizabeth. Like that. Diana Krall. Oppie Ludacris. Premier ministre Couillard. Chris Paul. Aussi sont condamnés à devoir manger pis take a shit once in a while.
Much like the viral video, Small Talk's Barrio Rich addresses the small particularities that represent Montreal. Filmed in an alleyway in the northern part of the downtown core, the video requires an intimate understanding of the space that is Montreal, the barrio that is so rich. Each line and each image is recognizable to a Montrealer and connects that individual to their own space, their own community. À la Claire Ensemble, Sauce Pois takes place in a Haitian restaurant celebrating Haitian food while also engaging with a huge range of references that are only evident to those who live in Montreal and understand its existence as a cultural crossroads. Again, like Small Talk, À la Claire provides access to an understanding of how culture works. It's not the mandated formal interculturalism, but a personal understanding of how people come together and the ways in which negotiation produces culture. This music and its accompanying videos present communities for whom the interculturalism model has led to a lack of appreciation of the actual reality of Quebecois identity and therefore limited levels of acceptance as actual Quebecois people in Quebec. It provides insight into how young people recognize, speak, and respond to culture in ways that might not fit with official policy, thus creating new opportunities for connections, as well as narratives of what it might mean to be a Quebecer. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Erin. And we are next going to hear from Del Cowie.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, first of all, is play a little bit of a clip of the song, and then I'm going to present the paper. So let's just do this. Okay. Maybe I'm not going to do that. It seems like okay, so I'm going to go back to, I'm just going to read the paper. It looks like it disappeared again, and I had it ready. Anyway, never mind. So the song I'm going to be talking about here is Bacardi Slang, and it's by Cardinal Official. Now, this song is firmly ensconced in Toronto's hip-hop canon. With Cardinal's distinctive delivery over a dancehall-influenced rhythm, he offers up a litany of African-American and standard English phrases and redefines them from the linguistic viewpoint of a young Black man in Toronto with a Jamaican background, localizing it to his Toronto reality. In a city where there is a sizable Black population, half the city's population are people of color, and over 200 languages are spoken, this vantage point has immediate resonance. Although the words and phrases weren't unfamiliar to Toronto's hip hop listeners, it was arguably the first time that there was an attempt to articulate them in a specific way for an audience both inside and outside of the city. Consequently, the song is more than a sum of its beats and rhymes. In essence, it marks out and claims space and territory. And I'm going to explore a little bit about why this is important and the context in which it emerged and why it's still relevant today. Bacardi Slang was Cardinal's first official single on a major label, and in many ways it marked the logical endpoint and lyrical crystallization of an underground independent hip-hop scene that had been bubbling for years in Toronto. Many of the roots of that scene can be traced back to the creation of a government arts program called Fresh Arts, of which Cardinal is arguably the most famous alumni. Cardinal himself has effusively lauded the program and termed it pivotal to his career. The social context in which Fresh Arts emerges is important to consider and dates back almost a decade before Bacardi Slang's release. April 29th, 1992 is the date that 4 Los Angeles police officers are acquitted in the beating of Black motorist Rodney King, leading to the Los Angeles Uprising. At the same time, 4,000 kilometers away in Toronto, tensions are rising. Just weeks earlier, 2 Toronto area police officers are acquitted in the shooting death of Black youth Michael Wade Lawson while he drove away in a stolen car. And on May 2nd, days after the unrest in Los Angeles had started, police shoot dead Raymond Lawrence, a 22-year-old Black man suspected of being a drug dealer, who they said was armed with a knife. On May 4th, 1992, Black Toronto activists organized a march against police brutality. At the end of the march, a confrontation with police led to what is referred to as the Yonge Street Uprising or Yonge Street Riots, depending on your perspective. Around 100 stores on the city's main retail strip were damaged and looted, and many people were injured and arrested. Alarmed, the left-leaning NDP provincial government immediately commissioned a report into race relations to explore the root causes of the uprising, and found, in blunt and unforgiving terms, that systemic and anti-Black racism was a pervasive barrier in everyday life for Black people. Fresh Arts was one of the programs that was set up for Black and marginalized youth in the wake of these findings. While it was a government-funded program, on the ground, Fresh Arts was a community-oriented hub for young artists of color, and directed and steered primarily by a group of established Black women creatives who served as mentors and administrators. Notably, these figures included award-winning dub poet Lillian Allen, and with her key contributions, Fresh Arts blossomed into a successful arts program. In addition to developing their artistic and performance skills, program participants were also encouraged to study their cultural histories. Joining the then teenage Cardinal, then known as Kool-Aid, in the Fresh Arts program would be other Black youth that would go on to become local legends, people such as Socrates, renowned music video director, Director X, R&B singer Julie Black, and Solitaire, who would actually go on to produce Bacardi Slang. These artists would form the leading members of Toronto hip-hop's burgeoning second generation that followed pioneers such as Maestro Fresh West, Mishimi, and the Dream Warriors. Using the skills of self-sufficiency they learned in the Fresh Arts program, Cardinal and his friends formed the Figures of Speech crew, and they helped to fuel an underground hip-hop movement in the mid to late 90s. Several other Toronto hip-hop artists also formed their own independent record labels, pressed up vinyl, and delivered vibrantly creative music that specifically addressed their immediate surroundings, which they recontextualized and renamed the T-Dot. Aside from a handful of local influential college radio hip-hop shows, they arguably garnered more attention for their work in Europe, Asia, and the US than at home, as their music rarely graced CanCon playlists. Intermittent music video airplay on Much Music would usually represent the height of their domestic attention and success. Cardinal's crew of collaborators had now expanded into a crew known as the Circle that increasingly asserted their own identity in the city where the music industry they encountered reflected the same structural racism identified in the 1992 Race Relations Report. Indeed, the recommendations of that Race Relations Report, including the Employment Equity Act and the Fresh Arts program itself, will be immediately and predictably eliminated in 1995 with the provincial election of the right-wing Conservative Party under the auspices of what was called the Common Sense Revolution. Additionally, Toronto was amalgamating into its 6 boroughs. I was emphasizing 6 there for some reason, I don't know why. And what was being called a mega city. Toronto hip hop artists quickly added the word to their lyrical lexicon and continued to react and resist being excluded by ensuring their voices couldn't be ignored. Starting with Circle member Shock Claire's 1997 What Does It Take video, which featured Fresh Arts trained singer Julie Black, the city's artists would often and increasingly affirm their aspirational ethos by placing themselves in some type of proximity to the CN Tower, the city's most prominent landmark, in videos and photos, almost certainly inspiring Drake to do the same thing on his infamous Views album cover almost 2 decades later. Revisiting Bacardi slang 20 years later, given this social context, it's clear that underneath the song's celebratory and humorous tone, this assertion of Black diasporic identity in the face of systemic exclusion and alienation is being forcefully driven home. And home is the operative word here. By claiming space and insisting on belonging with the phrase, and everybody knows it's the T-Dot, the unapologetic linguistic wordplay occurring on Cardinal's single was an intentional disruption and questioning of what was considered Canadian music at that time and was considered an anomaly to its gatekeepers. Today, with Drake's relentless code switching and The Weeknd drawing heavily on Ethiopian vocal traditions of his heritage, the lingua franca of negotiating diaspora is largely how Toronto music presents itself to the world through 2 of its biggest artists. On the surface, it would seem that what was once an anomaly is now the normality. But it's also worth noting that in a post-Bacardi slang reality, Drake recorded 2 of his breakout mixtapes at the Remix Project, an arts organization directly inspired by the Fresh Arts model. And The Weeknd himself has opened up a Toronto creative arts hub for youth in much the same vein. Given this small sliver of the historically hard-fought battle and negotiation for space and identity that has been waged by young Black music creatives in Toronto and Canada as a whole, and the ongoing persistence of structural barriers, it is worth asking what, if anything, has fundamentally changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Got some virtual applause there. And let's transition to Carl Wilson.
Hey, everybody. Thanks to Karen Thompson and the organizing committee and the staff at Mopop and all of you. I'm so happy to see all of you after all of this time. I wanted to note that I think that this is the first all-Canadian panel in the history of PopCon. So that landmark shouldn't go unmarked. Anyway, this paper was twice this length 8 hours ago, so let's go. It's called Sellable Songs for the Very Canadian. In their 1996 book, Mondo Canuck, Jeff Pevier and Greg Diamond wrote, "In the world of children's entertainment, Canada is something approaching its own Hollywood. It enjoys world renown and near global market saturation. It is looked up to and envied." They were talking about kids' TV and animation as well, but most of all, children's music. At that point, kid folk superstars Raffi, Sharon Lois and Bram, and Fred Penner, among others, had been moving platinum levels and selling out concerts internationally since the late 70s. By contrast, in 1993, the New York Times Style section quoted Howard Lieb, a music attorney who founded that year's Kids Music Seminar, saying, "We in the US don't have a children's music industry. Our industry is younger than the market we're trying to sell to." Canada doesn't get called Hollywood very often or very accurately, so why in children's music? It was the eternal junior sibling to the American cultural bully, pulling off something we do once in a while when conditions are right, locating our own niche in a cultural ecology. Canada nurtured a group of artists who defined themselves as singer-songwriters for children, not as a sideline like many previous folk musicians, not with puppets or characters as part of a TV franchise, but as their whole gig, and that was transformative. Like so many great initiatives in Canadian culture, it was kickstarted by an American. Well, not exactly. Estelle Klein moved to Toronto with her parents from Buffalo when she was only 3. But as the director of the Mariposa Folk Festival in the Toronto area from 1964 to 1980, Klein is acknowledged as a mentor and visionary. She had an anti-purist, inclusive view of folk that always included children's concerts. And in 1969, in cooperation with the local musicians union, that led to Mariposa in the Schools, an outreach program of workshops and concerts whose participants eventually included Sharon Hansen, Lois Lillienstein, and Jit Bram Morrison, Eric Nagler, Raffi's soon-to-be producer Ken Whiteley, his brother Chris Whiteley, Sharon Lewis and Brahms later producer Bill Usher, and many others. At first, the main appeal to the musicians was as an income supplement, but the scene's ambitions expanded. Ken Whiteley told me, "It became in some ways like a cooperative. You have a community of 30, 35 musicians, all working in schools doing different things. It was a stimulating thing. I think it's fair," he said, to make the analogy to Greenwich Village in the early 60s. Raffi Kevorkian was one of the later to join. Raised in an artistic Armenian family that had moved from Cairo to Toronto, he'd been striving to become a James Taylor singer-songwriter for adults and was not having a great time of it. There are rumors of frequent booing. He was considering giving up, but his wife and his mother-in-law were both teachers and urged him to bring his guitar into classrooms. And then in 1977, his mother-in-law suggested he make an album, saying there wasn't a lot on the market for her students to listen to. Raffi recruited Whiteley, who happened to know of a studio in nearby Hamilton, run by a couple of young brothers named Bob and Daniel Lemois. Ken Whiteley says, "Right from the get-go, I was not looking at the musical styles in any kind of narrow sense, but at making the music kind of funky and real and musical so that it was listenable for adults. The very thing that made it harder for me to be pinpointed as an artist, this very eclecticism, found this unique kind of niche." The result, Singable Songs for the Very Young, came out on Raffi's own label, Troubadour, and before long it was turning into a sleeper hit and eventually a massive one. Soon Sharon, Lois, and Bram made their own independent album with a similar musical scope. As my friend Michael Barkley wrote in a 2015 tribute to that 1978 debut, One Elephant, Deux Elephants, with a gusto I can't hope to match, quote, "The songs range from folk to calypso to country disco to doo-wop to Tin Pan Alley to Bach, with only 3 songs that might be considered cliches found on any kid's record. There are songs in French and one in Iroquois. Normally that kind of show-offy stylistic breadth adds up to a dog's breakfast. Not here. It takes a minor feat of genius to pull that off, like, say, the Magnetic Field's 69 love songs. That's to whom we should be comparing Sharon, Lois, and Bram, not the goddamn Barneys of the world that they rot. This isn't Yo Gabba Gabba, this is London calling, damn it." Importantly, these weren't side gigs. These were musicians bringing everything they had to bear. Though Toronto was the center of Canada's nascent music business in those early days of CanCon, it was still a branch plant to the American industry. Showbiz dreams didn't seem as realistic as in New York or LA. There were only so many slots. So these artists committed to children as an audience and didn't condescend or patronize. Whiteley also noted that Toronto's exploding diversity at the time meant these mostly white artists were being influenced by local Caribbean and African and other music in ways that anticipated the 80s so-called world music boom. And it was a particular Canadian moment, the Pierre Trudeau era, of an unprecedented cultural nationalism. Governments were promoting both national identity and multiculturalism, and a post-60s arts explosion was being richly funded, including Mariposa in the Schools and other arts for kids. Then in the 1980s, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation gave Sharon Lois and Bram and Fred Penner each their own TV shows, which were later picked up by Nickelodeon in the States. Raffi particularly was a keen businessman. Offered distribution from A&M in the States, he negotiated by arguing rightly that his albums would have a perennially self-renewing audience, with new kids coming into listening range every year. He also refused all commercial offers that could water down his brand. Raffi was Raffi, not a Baby Beluga movie tie-in or a stroller sponsorship. He safeguarded his intimate connection to his fans. Eventually, of course, Canadians' ecological niche faced an invasive species in the form of an overgrown plush purple dinosaur, among many others. Neoliberal governments would cut back, and the US industry would catch up. But for a while, there was space to grow in a field that didn't require expensive production or vast promotional resources. It's a pattern that repeats itself in Canada. Isolated northern musicians had few roots to become slick song and dance idols, but they could stay in and focus on introspective poetic songwriting, the making of posers like Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, and Leonard Cohen. The National Film Board and others found their niches in documentary and animation. There are parallels in electronic music and in comedy. Later, as the internet erased distances, Canadians were newly able to take advantage of the blog rock 2000s with collectives like Broken Social Scene and the New Pornographers, and then the online mixtape world, which yielded Drake and The Weeknd. Maybe there's an adage here for an age of inequality. Rather than contort yourself to demand, find something nobody seems to want that you believe is worth doing. Perhaps a lot of other people secretly want it too. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl. And next up is Emily Gale.
Greetings from Cork, and thank you to my co-panelists and to Erin for inviting me to participate. I haven't lived in Canada now for just over 12 years, so I feel like a little bit of an outsider here, which is a good segue to my topic. Outsider music, affecting, radical. Critics have used these terms to praise innocence and despair, a 2001 re-release of an obscure recording made in the late 1970s by Hans Fanger and his elementary-age students in a school gymnasium in British Columbia. The Langley School's music project consisted of Fanger on acoustic guitar and piano and a choir of 9 to 12-year-olds who accompany their singing on a quirky orchestra of Orff-adjacent percussion. Brian Linz, a record collector and radio DJ from Victoria, Canada, discovered the records in June 2000 while crate digging in a Vancouver SPCA thrift store. Linz then contacted Erwin Chusid of the freeform radio station WFMU in New Jersey, and eventually the recording found a commercial home on Bar None Records. The re-release has circulated widely and to great acclaim, and supposedly inspired the 2003 film School of Rock. David Bowie himself even praised the kids' rendition of Space Oddity. In subsequent interviews, Fanger has downplayed his role as educator, emphasizing instead the now familiar pop pedagogical goals of building confidence and instilling a love of music in students. These goals are admirable, and the success of Fanger's approach is self-evident in the group's recordings. This surprising album, however, also serves as a starting point for necessary discussion about pop canons and cultural imperialism in the context of music education. The album was recorded in Langley, British Columbia, a white rural and religious suburb of Vancouver. Fanger was a hippie and a musician who was looking for a secure way to make a living. He connected with the kids because of how different he seemed in comparison to the other teachers in the district. Namely, he was cool. In the aftermath of the album's re-release, Fanger has discussed the ways that the kids connected to the music they sang, and certainly this sounds to be the case. These amateur interpretations with their muddy acoustic guitar and enthusiastic percussion that radically rewrites the rules of rhythm, they get me every time. So let's just listen to a quick excerpt.
No one
You'll have to listen to the rest yourself. So you can hear here the fun, and this kind of learning is not to be underestimated. I think, however, we could pause to simultaneously consider the ways that the politics of selection reveal certain priorities. The album's track listing, in fact, could be used as a justification for CanCon broadcasting quotas. It uncovers a strong preference for Anglo-pop songs from the late 1950s through to the mid-1970s when it was recorded. There are 7 songs by the Beach Boys, 2 by Wings, 1 each by David Bowie, Barry Manilow, Herman's Hermits, the Eagles, and several others. Despite the fact that Canada has 2 official languages, of the LP's 21 tracks, all of the songs are in English. This is not so surprising given the relatively small proportion of French speakers in Western Canada. Perhaps more surprising is the fact that only one of the songs on the album can be configured as a Canadian song. Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft by Toronto's Klaatu closes the album, and likely here the referent was the hit version by the Carpenters, whose rendition reached the top 10 in the UK and in Canada and #1 in Ireland. This selection of songs, maybe doesn't seem so out of step for late 1970s Langley, but a VH1 special from the album's re-release shows Fanger in a pretty different classroom. He appears teaching a room of predominantly Asian students and notes the ways that singing has helped some of them to learn English. Today's Vancouver and surrounding areas reveals a pretty different language landscape. Punjabi, Cantonese, Mandarin, Tagalog, and Korean are the most common non-official language mother tongues, according to a 2011 Statistics Canada census. I want to be cautious here. I don't mean to suggest a flattening of meaning around white bread music for non-white listeners and participants. Indeed, Karen Tongson's account of the Carpenters shows us the complexities of our musical attachments. But I do want to suggest that the politics of repertory selection by choral leaders is far from neutral and warrants careful consideration, as well as input from the students themselves. During my own undergraduate degree as a piano major, I had to enroll in a large ensemble. Pianists landed in the choir, where we were grouped with guitarists and vocalists. A few weeks into one of our semesters, a song was suddenly removed from the list of concert repertory that we were preparing for the winter concert. The song was Turkey in the Straw. Someone had quietly raised the question of the song's racist origins in 19th century minstrel shows. Notably, there was no explanation or discussion of the edit in our choir rehearsal room. I've revisited this memory often. It's not easy, but necessary as a teacher to admit mistakes or own the harm that you may have caused. But the silence that surrounded this incident strikes me as an especially Canadian response. We white Canadians are good at patting ourselves on the back for tolerance and inclusion, but less comfortable with difficult self-examination around issues of multiculturalism. Sentimentality can play a powerful role in music pedagogy. It feels good to connect over and through music. I don't know how Fanger, who is now retired, or my former choral director would now approach the politics of selection. But I do know that these 2 examples invite us as music educators to think critically through the ways that national mythologies shape our engagements or lack thereof. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And last but not least, in our presentations, Andrea Warner.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited about this. I have 2 photos that I was going to try and share in the chat, but that doesn't really seem possible at this moment, so maybe I'll share them at the end. Who knows? Rae Jepsen, the teen pop star who never was. This is a brief trip back in time to 2012. When January 1st cracked open the new year, most Americans had never heard of Canadian singer Rae Jepsen. In February, Justin Bieber uploaded a video of himself and his famous friends lip-syncing to Jepsen's Call Me Maybe. Within 24 hours, there were 1 million views. When Jepsen released the song in the USA a few weeks later, no introduction was necessary. Call Me Maybe was one of the biggest hits on the planet. It didn't just belong to Jepsen, it belonged to the world. Call Me Maybe is one of the few songs that lives inside our heads, always at the ready. Most of you know the words, even if you've tried to resist it. It's been 8 years, but we still know, hey, I just met you, and this is crazy. But here's my number, so call me maybe. The sing-song charm is a kind of incantation, a magic spell that unlocks a childlike capacity for wonder and enchantment in all its listeners. This is how Call Me Maybe transcends the sparkling promise of teen pop and delivers a literal fountain of youth. For 3 minutes and 13 seconds, our most purely joyful, unjaded selves are restored. Even in 2012, the song's spirit, its ability to channel youthfulness in its chords, was powerful. Almost everybody, press and fans alike, seemed shocked that Jepsen, pop's new teen queen, was not an actual teenager. She was a 26-year-old woman, a former musical theater student turned singer-songwriter who was still waitressing as Call Me Maybe began to climb the charts. First, the song. So these are some ways in which Call Me Maybe is obviously the purest teen pop that ever existed. 1. No punctuation. Commas and question marks are the concerns of the olds, 25 and up only, even before emojis took over the bulk of our messaging. 2. Bold declarations and repetition. Before you came into my life, I missed you so bad. I missed you so bad. I missed you so, so bad. These are the all-consuming, sweetly earnest, wholly undignified words of a walking raw nerve, otherwise known as a teenager. 3. Call Me Maybe has the musical urgency of a hormone monster. The melody chases itself up and down the keys, the synthesized strings flush and flourish, and through it all, Jepsen's voice sounds like her smile has never known braces. Call Me Maybe floated around Canada in the fall of 2011 and got a little bit of love, but it didn't kick into high gear until Bieber, fellow Canadian and real 17-year-old boy, heard it on a trip back home in December. Bieber was blown away, and his manager, Scooter Braun, contemporary music's major colonizer of teen talent, signed Jepsen to his label. After that, Jepsen and Bieber's names were inextricably linked. She opened for him on tour, and she was seen as a potential heir to the teen pop domain he was forsaking in favor of more grown-up pursuits in R&B and hip-hop. She was 8 years his senior in real life, but his junior everywhere else. Some interviewers probed Jepsen about her age, inquiring how she felt about going on the road with a teenage boy and being mistaken for a teen. At least one journalist relayed the surprise, quote, fans felt about learning she was 26. The AP mistakenly identified Jepsen as 16 years old, an error that was picked up on in other publications and never corrected. Nobody in Jepsen's camp seemed to be hiding it, but there were a few choices that could be read as obscuring. I'm going to drop 2 images at the end so you can see what I'm talking about, but there were countless hats, as if a slightly older stylist had grown up watching Blossom and decided that these were the epitome of quirky youth. There was also the album cover. A thick shag of bangs hangs into Jepsen's eyelashes, and she's crouched down wearing white ankle socks and gold high heels with denim shorts. The styling is more child-playing dress-up than grown woman. A kind of think piece cottage industry sprang up around Jepsen, and writers spilled millions of words vying to become part of the cultural conversation surrounding Call Me Maybe. Some of the writing defaulted to comparing and contrasting Jepsen with other musicians, exclusively those who happen to also identify as young and female. The Guardian positioned Jepsen's breakthrough as a kind of antidote to, quote, Rihanna's sexual voraciousness, the trashy alco-pop of Kesha and Katy Perry, and Adele's Bath of My Own Tears emotions. A Pop Matters writer also praised Jepsen for reminding him, quote, how great pop music can be whenever it decides to return to fun and innocence. He claimed Katy Perry was too weathered, Lady Gaga's audience was more mature and too queer, and Rihanna was too sexy. Jepsen was the only bowl of porridge that could satisfy this Goldilocks. This is an objectively terrible take, and the wrong one. The fun and innocence of Call Me Maybe is deeply rooted in its celebration and validation of female sexuality and agency. Call Me Maybe embodies a stereotypical girlishness that is historically trivialized and invalidated because the patriarchy is joyless, desperate, and fearful. But this is the song's power. It isn't for the patriarchy, it's for the rest of us. Call Me Maybe is a fun song about a girl who knows what and who she wants. Its melodic line evokes double rainbows, and its lyrical substance is akin to candy apples. It has more bounce than a billion cheerleaders, the glow of 70 zillion suns, and the wild, naive hope of one human heart. If you make space for even a fraction of this song's glee, you're basically reborn every time you answer its call. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. So we have about 15 minutes or so for conversation amongst the panelists. This is amazing because usually in PopCon there's never any time. So finally we've done it virtually and we actually have time. But first I think we should get to a couple of the questions that are in the chat. I think there's some questions, or maybe they're just mostly comments. Let me just make sure. Maybe actually we could just start with Ann Power's comments, which refer to children's and teen choral programs now focusing on the covering of pop music. And there's a little bit in the chat you can go through and look at. And maybe if anybody wants to comment on that or make reference to it. Feel free to jump in, anyone. I think everyone's reading the chat.
I'll
Karen?
comment real quick.
Oh, go ahead there.
Because I commented in the chat, but also it looks like Glenn had some things to add as well. That, you know, I love that. First of all, this was a great roundtable, but I loved how Anne pointed this out as a kind of lipstick trace, the kind of covering of pop music in choral scenarios. And I was also just thinking about whatever impact, you know, the kind of visual representation of this in School of Rock or Glee may have had in veering choral repertoires to the popular. And it's kind of interesting because that was always the Carpenters choir director at Cal State Long Beach wrote a piece, a pedagogical piece for choir directors about how someday this choral approach to pop would become ubiquitous, right? And that we would have more choral, like pop music or pop music being kind of covered by choirs. Anyway, I just thought that I'd add that in there as a kind of remark alongside, you know, whatever Glenn was saying too about PS22 and the Idol cover, just to get things rolling.
I guess one thing I would think about in terms of that comparison is the extent to which things like School of Rock or now Glee really kind of raise the bar and the kind of standards of professionalization for that kind of engagement. Whereas I think one of the things that people respond to, that people respond to with the Langley Schools project is its true kind of embrace of the amateur kind of, and the joy of just kind of practicing and learning some pop music, but not having it be like so thoroughly kind of professionalized and polished.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've wondered about working on this was the way that I don't know, but my sensation is that a lot of the sort of youth music feeling and what's recognized now has become much more pop dominated than it historically was too, and that's so in listening patterns as well as in what people choose in music education to use. And I think to some degree, you know, especially in the streaming era, I would imagine, but definitely, you know, post-Glee and all of those kinds of things. I wonder how much educators are now responding to the sense of what kids know and are familiar with and responsive to, and how far away from a kind of traditional repertoire of children's music that the audience has moved. So that seems like one of the factors that might be going on.
Does anybody else want to jump in with a comment or anything related to the panel? Panelists, this is your chance to talk with each other.
I wanted to ask Del, and I know that we've talked about this a little bit before, but this idea of sort of the language of Toronto and sort of the language of Montreal. I mean, it sort of is accepted that, you know, you have this thing called multicultural London English that exists. And there is like sort of some types of discussion in Toronto about the existence of multicultural Toronto English, say, and some discussion in Montreal about what you might refer to, I guess, as multicultural Montreal French. But it hasn't really seemed to take on the kind of importance as it has in London, and often ends up with people kind of denying, let's just say specifically, the very Jamaican roots of a lot of the language that's used within hip hop or even within youth culture in Toronto. So much so that I know that Lily Singh was definitely spoken to quite seriously about her lack of acknowledgement of the support of some of this language. And this was sort of discussed last year. Do you feel like, because obviously a Cardinal official is very clear about this in Bacardi slang. Do you feel that people just gone away from that? Like what's happened between that point and then where we are now, where people are having to say, hey, let's look at this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, for everyone who wasn't, I don't think I mentioned it in the actual paper, but Bacardi slang is basically 20 years old, which actually now, is hard to believe for me. But I do think, though, so I think what has happened in that interim, in that time period, has been, I think, like I said, it seemed like it was an anomaly at the time, but it wasn't really for the people who lived that culture. And I think what we've seen over the couple more decades is obviously hip hop's, popularity, and it has seeped, it was already popular, obviously, but the thing is that in specifically in Toronto, it's become more and more, part of the fabric. And now, virtually the most popular artists are hip hop artists in a lot of ways. Now, I know what you're saying in terms of like, so what's happened is that he's definitely claiming that language. He's claiming it linguistically. I think what's happened though, and then this has been the subject of a number of think pieces in recent months and the last couple of years, is like, this is this new Toronto slang. And I think that the issue is that, the lack of, and then the assumption is that it's shared, that everyone can partake, everyone can, and everyone says it. And a lot of people do it like unconsciously, quite honestly, and not realizing the origins of it. So I think that's what the issue is. I think what needs to happen more is to kind of actually acknowledge that origin, and to acknowledge those voices, because as I outlined in my paper, the systemic issues still, exist. So when you kind of don't acknowledge that origin, what usually happens is that the people who who originated it don't get any benefit out of it whatsoever. So then you get, and then if for the people who are listening in parts and into this panel, if you're not in Toronto, if you're in Toronto, you would see things like Drake yoga, or I don't know, things like or people trademarking things that are named after the Six, so to speak. So and then making money off of these things that have zero ties to the hip hop community, and this is kind of the popularization of an exploitation of Black and hip hop culture in that is specific to Toronto. So yeah, that's why I think it's problematic. And so I think the acknowledging of it is important. And, and Bacardi slang is a definite example of that. But I think, yeah, it is on a slippery slope. And I think basically, it needs to be pointed out and basically called out when it does happen. Now, I think, we're in an interesting moment, as we all know, in this year. And that is, I think, starting to happen a bit more. But I think up until this year, there were kind of, there were definitely some things where people might not have done that. But I've been like, hey, we're all Canadian. This is a multicultural thing. We all partake. But I do think that we need to acknowledge the origins, and that needs to be done with the systemic issues that exist.
Now, there's a follow-up question from Glenn in the chat. It says, like every new early 2000s indie band running to get an apartment and claim they were from Montreal, I know of Ottawa-based hip-hop artists, a growing scene, who are rushing to now say that they're from Toronto, how might something like a new version of Fresh Arts help build a sense of regional industry?
So sorry, is that I'm reading the question too, and I'm wondering if it means Fresh Arts in Ottawa. I think it's what Glenn is referring to. I think yes, in Ottawa. Okay, he's saying yes in Ottawa. I do think I do think that would be helpful. I mean, I think hip hop has always been very specific to tight like each city or even neighborhood kind of origins, right? So I could see why an Ottawa artist who wants to kind of maybe make a quick name for themselves might want to identify with Toronto. And I think we've seen it in more recent years. I'm not going to say the name Belly, but I mean, basically there are artists that were originally from Ottawa that are now claiming to be from Toronto. And Ottawa is, the capital of Canada, but, in terms of cultural weight and heft and that kind of thing, it's not really, it doesn't really register in that way. It's more obviously a political city. So the thing is that, I do think that these hubs, these creative hubs have proven, I mean, given the issues and the realities that exist, I mean, what we do know is that any time youth are together and creative and together, and they can be in some kind of hub, and they're directed, or not directed, but that they're given a chance and the resources to explore and to do things, they can create amazing things. So I do think that it's in Ottawa, and as Glenn is talking about, there's a large Black, French, and Somali kind of and Sudanese creative community there. I think the thing about Canada is and I guess in Ottawa here is that every area is going to come up with their own version of what it's not going to be the same as Toronto. It's going to be different. And even in Toronto, it's changed over the years, right? So Bacardi slang is a very specifically West Indian kind of and Jamaican, I guess, version of a diasporic culture, whereas in the interim, there is more of a Somali community now in Toronto. There is, and then there's also a number of prominent artists whose family heritage is from Ghana. So, and so on. So you will see these things evolve, and I think in Ottawa it could be the same thing could happen. I haven't heard too much of that recently, but I mean, definitely, again, if they're given the resources, things could happen for sure.
Thank you, Dale. I think we're just about out of time, unless there's any last comments.
I mean, I was just wondering, in following up with what Del was saying, Erin, whether there's, I was talking about schools programs and Del was talking about Fresh Arts. And I wonder in Montreal, obviously with very different kind of way cultural institutions work in Quebec, whether the artists that you're talking about have those whether there are any parallel kind of community oriented programs that do speak to those communities and develop artists there?
I'm not going to speak to directly programs. There are all sorts of cultural programs that are specific to the French language, and even in Quebec there are cultural programs that are specific to like minority language communities, which basically includes mostly English. But what I would say is that in 2016, which was the big anniversary of Law 101, which the law that said that French is the official language, and that had a range of repercussions, one of which was the fact that anyone whose parents were not educated in English in Canada, and specifically in Quebec, could not send their children to an English school. And so therefore they would be going to a French language school from the beginning all the way up until their choice, their college or university career. So because of that, it's kind of in 2016, there was a documentary made at the college where I work, where there was this whole sort of sense of, isn't it really too bad that these young people, they don't really understand Quebecois culture? And it was kind of a shocking thing, or maybe just tiresome, frankly, this idea that if you're not presenting a particular version Quebecois culture, and that is through music, through art, through cinema, through television. I mean, maybe people know that the French version of Brooklyn Nine-Nine that's just set for release in Quebec transformed the entire cast into white people. So this is the kind of thing that happens very often in Quebec. And so because of this insistence on the centrality of French culture and this lack of recognition of what other things are happening, you end up with an emphasis on French and French language. And in preparation for what I said today, when it was going to be a bit longer, I went to it was a panel discussion on Quebecois hip hop, and there was a representative from the Office for French Song who was saying, well, this is all well and good, but it has to be in French if it's going to be Quebecois music, because it has to be the French song. And so there's a lot of that kind of language politics that shapes the discussion, and then it really kind of undermines the expression of the experiences of minority language groups and also marginalized cultures.
Thank you, Erin. I just want to thank the entire roundtable. We've got to wrap up now, but thanks to Erin, thanks Andrea, thanks Emily, thanks Dell, thanks Carl, thanks Steacy. Thank you for your expertise. I see a book coming out of this, I think, on Canadian content. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.